Alright YouTube, unless you have particular interest in the topic, you probably haven't heard anything about Fukushima Daiichi in over a year, because nobody was really talking about it. As soon as they got sort of the spent fuel rods out of Unit 4, people sort of calmed down. Now, keep in mind, the area around the Fukushima power plant is still filled with thousands and thousands of tanks of highly radioactive water that's been drained off. What they do is they pump seawater into these plants to keep the aquarium cool and to keep things, I guess, from getting too dry, you know, radioactive dust and smoke and explosions and stuff. They keep it wet, and then they pump that liquid back out to keep the radiation count a little lower, and they put it in these tanks on site. There are literally thousands and thousands of these gigantic tanks containing highly radioactive water. There is radioactivity in the groundwater. At least one of the exhaust stacks is so radioactive that getting up near it where it's damaged would probably kill you in a few minutes. So there's a lot of fucked up shit at Fukushima. Now there's a typhoon headed right at it. Now, in the last few years, several major storm fronts have gone through the region. None of them have been this strong, and none of them have been predicted to hit it this directly. I think the last one, which was I want to say around this time in 2014, I believe, it's been quite a while, only gave it a glancing blow. You didn't have a strong storm surge, you didn't have that much rain. You did get inundation. There was a partial collapse of one hillside near Fukushima that cut off one of the roads, but ultimately it didn't really, it wasn't really a problem. The problem is a large typhoon headed there, if it knocks out some of the power generation, those pumps stop working. It could also damage or destroy some of these tanks. You get a nice sheen of wind coming off the ocean. It could knock like 100 of them over for all we know. It could cause absolute havoc. You wouldn't be able to have people working on the site for a considerable length of time, or they'd have to be wearing something better than the normal sort of low stage hazmat suits they're typically wearing there. I don't know why they don't have them in full high-tech suits, honestly. Seems like a bad idea. Got to the point where over a year ago, they had already basically stopped hiring Japanese workers, and they had started hiring foreign labor from like the Philippines, Thailand, and places like that. They come there, they pay them half as much as they would pay a Japanese person, work them twice as hard, and the person's still making like 3 or 4 times the average salary in their home country. They give them a rudimentary training course, they have them work there for a few months, then they've had their lifetime dose of radiation by that point, and they send them home. They made like, a couple years' salary in the course of a few months, and they think that they're sitting pretty until they get cancer 10, 20 years down the road. And TEPCO faced a lot of backlash for that practice, but there's really nothing they can do. There aren't very many people that are skilled enough to do this work left in Japan that haven't already been hired and fired because they've already hit their lifetime radiation limit. All you need is for that highly radioactive exhaust stack to fall down on one of these parts of the plant and shower it with extremely high emission radioactive sources, and you're kind of screwed as far as working in and around that specific building. You're going to have to call in the bulldozers and the tanks all over again. It's going to look a little bit like Chernobyl. Now, would this lead to like a new steam explosion? No, probably not. If the generation got destroyed and the area became completely impassable and soaked in enough emitters so they couldn't get near it, then you could have that problem. I don't think that's likely. I think most likely, if anything happens there, they're likely to lose some of those holding tanks, which means there will be radiation spilled. That exhaust stack that's sticking up, a couple 100 feet in the air could topple over. It could peel away the facade on some of the buildings that they've sort of built skeletons around to retain more of the radiation and set up their equipment for removing radioactive material, sort of contain it at least a little bit. They could lose some of this equipment. Of course, they've got like cranes and stuff around there. It's entirely possible. When you're talking about a direct hit, you're not talking about a glancing blow. Oh yeah, we get a lot of rain and some high wind for a few hours. We're talking a sustained period of heavy storm surge, coupled with extremely high winds and an enormous amount of rain. And it looks like it's going to be a direct hit, literally right on Fukushima, as in it couldn't be more centered on the power plant. It's coming right at it. I think it's going to hit tomorrow, if I remember correctly. So that could be a concern. You could see some events happen there. I'll be watching the live stream, trust me, all day. In between editing and, YouTubing, of course. But I'll definitely be paying attention to the stream, because I wouldn't be surprised to see some damage at the site. And also, remember, the Fukushima Daiichi power plant is right near the shore. It's protected by a little seawall and not much else. And right behind it are a lot of fairly steep hills that, get a nice big typhoon, there could be a landslide in that region. That could definitely take out a crane. It could take out some holding tanks. It could probably take out the road leading to the plant, in which case you have to dig that shit out before you can maintain the generators. It could certainly damage generation systems. It could knock that exhaust stack down. It could definitely rip off facade siding from any of these units. Unit 4 is the one, I believe, most centered on the live feed. It's the most interesting of the units because it still contains, I believe, a small amount of the spent fuel rods. I don't think they pulled all of them out. I think they emptied one holding tank. They emptied most of another. That's no longer that big a concern. I was actually surprised that they managed to empty these tanks without something catastrophic happening, because TEPCO obviously doesn't know what it's doing in many of these situations. They tried to freeze the ground to create an ice barrier to hold in the radiation. It didn't work either, because the radiation level in the groundwater is high enough to actually keep melting through it. So that didn't work. They're talking about pumping zeolite into the ground. They keep talking about all these crazy ideas. Instead of just covering it with cement and building the cement down a good 50 feet into the ground to try to contain it at least on the surface and get rid of the topsoil and be done with it. Maybe put a hill in between the plant and the ocean to keep it from leaching into there as easily. Instead of doing something like that takes a long time and a lot of manpower but is at least pragmatic and feasible, they kept talking about this fucking ice wall that never worked. They talk about, oh, well, maybe we could fill this whole area in. Oh, where's the corium? We don't even quite know. Turns out it's definitely escaped containment. That's why the groundwater supply is so radioactive. There's still like chunks of hot particle all over the place, scattered for miles in every direction. People go urban exploring sort of within the exclusion zone. Not a great idea. Wait a good 20 or 30 years for some of the mid-lived isotopes to, die down a little bit like people do at Chernobyl. You can wander in around Chernobyl in most areas, and as long as you got some gloves and a face mask, you're probably fine. You don't want to go in and look at the elephant's foot dressed like that, but you can wander around Chernobyl at large and be fairly safe. As opposed to Fukushima, the levels are considerably higher, because it's considerably more recent. Some of those isotopes at Chernobyl have undergone at least, a half-life or most of a half-life. It's a little bit less of it there. Fukushima also involved more radioactive material getting blown sky high. I don't care what the idea that one reactor at Chernobyl released more radioactive material than several reactors as well as multiple other pieces of material, spent fuel rods and so forth at Fukushima, I think is blatantly wrong. They are blatantly underestimating the release, but let's assume that they're right. It doesn't even matter. The area is full of tanks of radioactive water that are poorly secured. They were sealing some of these tanks with duct tape. Now that doesn't exactly seem like the best idea in the world. I think they're underestimating the hazards of radiation a little bit. So we'll see what happens. Fukushima could experience some, it's probable that they're going to experience at least a few of these storage tanks falling over. It's probably going to cause some damage to their power generation, regardless of what happens. Of course, if the water stops pumping for more than a few hours at a time, the water begins to heat up quite considerably in steam. You get enough of that steam coming off, it's going to be very difficult to cool it back down. You get this radioactive clouds of steam coming out of the plant. It's just not good for man or beast. That's about all. Peace.